What did Louis XVI shout before the guillotine fell, and why no one heard him? French Revolution. Imagine the coldest morning in the history of France. It is January 21st, 1793. The fog clings to the cobblestones of Paris like a shroud, and a damp, biting frost has turned the city into a graveyard of grey stone and iron. Deep within the walls of the Temple prison, a man who was once considered a living god on earth is being woken for the last time. He is no longer called His Most Christian Majesty. To the men guarding his door, to the radicals screaming in the streets, and to the blade waiting in the square, he is simply Louis Capet. But as he rises from his narrow bed, Louis XVI still carries the invisible weight of 1,000 years of monarchy on his slumped shoulders. He believes that even now, at the edge of the abyss, his voice holds a power that can transcend the hatred of the revolution. He has spent his final night writing, refining a message, preparing a speech that he believes will ripple through the hearts of the 100,000 citizens waiting for him in the Place de la Révolution. He believes that if he can just speak, if he can just be heard, the soul of France will remember its father. But what Louis does not know is that his enemies are more afraid of his tongue than they are of his crown. They have already signed a second secret sentence, a sentence of silence. They have decided that the world must see the king die, but they must never, under any circumstances, hear him speak. The tragedy of Louis XVI did not begin on the scaffold, but in the shimmering, suffocating gold of Versailles. To understand why a nation decided to cut off the head of its own father, you have to understand the man who was never meant to lead. Louis was never the charismatic son that his ancestor Louis XIV had been. He was a quiet, shy, and deeply introverted man who preferred the mechanical precision of locks and the silent logic of maps to the treacherous whispers of a royal court. He inherited a kingdom that was bleeding. France was a land of staggering contrasts, where the halls of Versailles were perfumed to mask the scent of power, while just miles away, mothers in Paris watched their children wither from hunger because the price of a loaf of bread had surpassed a week's wages. Louis sat upon a throne that was already cracking, yet for years he lived in a bubble of absolute prestige. He was the heir to the Sun King, the absolute ruler of 25 million souls, protected by a wall of tradition and the belief that his right to rule was ordained by God himself. In those early years, the king was not hated. He was seen as a well-meaning but distant figure, a man trapped in a system that was failing. But the revolution is a beast that grows hungrier with every concession, and the king's greatest weakness was his inability to decide whether to be a tyrant or a liberator. As the fires of 1789 began to burn, as the Bastille fell, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man was penned in the ink of rebellion, Louis remained a figure of strange, tragic stability. Even when the mob marched on Versailles and forced the royal family to return to Paris like captives, the people still shouted, "Long live the king!" They wanted a father who would understand their pain. They wanted a monarch who would finally see them. But Louis was a man of the old world, a man who believed that his authority was a sacred trust that could not be bargained away. This was his first fatal error, the belief that he could wait out the storm. He sat in the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by guards and the constant rhythmic chanting of the crowds outside, watching as the world he knew was dismantled piece by piece. The nobility fled, the church was stripped of its land, and the very air of Paris began to smell of change and gunpowder. Still, the king held on to the hope that the fever of the revolution would break. He did not realize that the fever was not a sickness, but a rebirth, one that would require a sacrifice. The turning point, the moment the shadow of the guillotine first truly touched the king's neck, came on a dark night in June 1791. This was the infamous flight to Varennes, a desperate, clumsy attempt by the royal family to escape the capital and reach a royalist stronghold near the border. Had Louis been a different man, a more ruthless man, he might have made it. But even in flight, he could not shed the skin of a king. He insisted on traveling in a massive, heavy carriage that moved at a snail's pace. He stopped to eat, to rest, almost as if he couldn't believe that his own people would truly stop him. But he was recognized at a small outpost by a postmaster who compared the man's face to the image on a piece of paper money. The king was caught. The return to Paris was not a procession, it was a funeral for the monarchy. The crowds that lined the streets did not cheer, and they did not boo. They stood in a terrifying, absolute silence, hats firmly on their heads, refusing to show the traditional mark of respect to a monarch. In that silence, Louis XVI died as a king, and the prisoner, Louis Capet, was born. He had committed the ultimate sin in the eyes of the revolutionaries. He had tried to abandon his people. He was no longer the father of the nation. He was a traitor who had tried to run to the arms of France's enemies. From that moment on, the walls began to close in. The Tuileries Palace, once a residence of the Caesars of France, became a gilded cage, and then a battlefield. In August 1792, the mob finally broke through. They slaughtered the Swiss Guard, the king's final protectors, in a frenzied explosion of violence that left the palace floors slick with blood. Louis, seeking refuge in the National Assembly, watched as his title was abolished. The monarchy was dead. The Republic was born. And the man who had once been the center of the universe was moved to the Temple, a medieval fortress that felt more like a tomb than a prison. It is here, in the damp cold of the Temple, that the psychological warfare against the king began in earnest. The revolutionaries knew that to kill the king, they first had to kill the idea of the king. They stripped him of his honors, his servants, and eventually his family. They forced him to hear the shouts from the street calling for his head. They made him watch through the windows as the head of his wife's closest friend, the Princess de Lamballe, was paraded past on a pike, her hair matted with gore. Yet, in the face of this systematic humiliation, a strange transformation occurred. The indecisive, wavering king began to find a quiet, stoic dignity. As he sat in his cell, reading the history of England's Charles I, another king who lost his head to a revolution, Louis seemed to accept that his path was leading to the scaffold. He spent his days teaching his son, the young Dauphin, and praying, but the Republic could not let him simply exist. As long as Louis lived, he was a focal point for every royalist, every foreign army, and every person who feared the escalating violence of the Jacobins. Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible voice of the radical revolution, made the logic clear. Louis must die so that the nation may live. There was no room for mercy in the New World. The trial of Louis XVI was not a search for truth, it was a political necessity. The charges were vague: tyranny, treason, crimes against the state, but the outcome was predetermined. The trial took place in the winter of 1792, in a hall filled with the most radical minds of the age. Louis stood before them, dressed simply, his voice calm. He defended himself with a logic and a clarity that surprised his accusers. He denied the charges of shedding the blood of his people, pointing out that he had always sought to avoid civil war. But the trial wasn't about what he had done, it was about who he was. To the men of the convention, his very existence was a crime against the equality of man. When the time came to vote, the room was thick with tension. One by one, the deputies stepped forward to announce their verdict in public. Some voted for death with tears in their eyes, others with a sense of triumphant joy. Even the king's own cousin, Philippe Égalité, voted for his execution, a betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. The sentence was passed. Death within 24 hours. Now we return to that frozen morning in January. The carriage carrying Louis rumbles through the streets of Paris. The city is under martial law. Every window is closed, every door locked. General Santerre, a man of iron will and revolutionary fervor, leads the escort of thousands of armed guards. Louis sits inside, reading the prayers for the dying. He is remarkably composed. He has made his peace with God, but he has one final duty to his legacy. He has a speech. He knows that the crowd at the Place de la Révolution will be massive. He knows that among the 100,000 people, there are many who are there not to celebrate, but because they are terrified. He believes that his words, the words of a dying king, will carry a weight that no revolutionary pamphlet can match. He intends to proclaim his innocence, to forgive his enemies, and to pray that his blood does not fall on France. He believes in the power of the human voice to pierce the darkness of a political storm, but as the carriage slows and the towering silhouette of the guillotine comes into view, a different kind of sound begins to rise. Not the sound of a crowd, but a rhythmic, mechanical thumping, the sound of drums. Dozens of drummers are positioned around the scaffold, their sticks poised, waiting for a signal. The revolutionary leaders have anticipated the king's last words, and they have prepared a wall of noise to swallow them whole. The man who once commanded the silence of a kingdom is about to be silenced by the sound of the Republic. The carriage comes to a heavy, shuddering halt. Outside the wooden walls of the vehicle, the world has become a vacuum of sound. For the last hour, Louis XVI has travelled through the streets of his capital in a state of suspended animation, protected from the sight of his people by a wall of bayonets and the grim, unyielding faces of the National Guard. But now the door opens, and the reality of the Place de la Révolution rushes in like a tidal wave of ice and iron. The square is a sea of humanity. Nearly 100,000 people have gathered to witness the impossible. They are packed onto rooftops, clinging to the branches of leafless trees and standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud. The silence is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a held breath, the silence of a predator watching its prey. At the center of this human ocean stands the scaffold, a raw, unpainted wooden platform that looks disturbingly fragile against the backdrop of the grey Parisian sky. And atop that platform sits the national razor, the guillotine, its slanted blade gleaming with a dull, matte finish, waiting to claim the most significant neck in Europe. As Louis steps out of the carriage, he is immediately met with a new form of resistance. He is no longer a king, and the men surrounding him are determined to make him feel the full weight of his new diminished status. The executioners, led by Charles-Henri Sanson, approach him. Sanson is a man trapped in a nightmare of his own. He is a professional, a man whose family has been the official executioners of Paris for generations, but he is also a man who still harbors a secret, lingering respect for the crown. Yet he has a job to do, and the eyes of the Republic are upon him. The first conflict arises over the king's coat. The guards demand he remove it. Louis, shivering in the biting January wind, initially refuses, a final flash of royal pride sparking in his eyes. But he sees the futility of the gesture and slowly peels away the brown coat, handing it to his confessor, the Abbé Edgeworth. He stands now in a white flannel waistcoat and grey breeches, a figure of stark, vulnerable paleness against the dark military uniforms of his captors. But the true humiliation is yet to come. The executioners produce a length of thick, coarse rope and move to bind his hands behind his back. This is the moment where the man inside the king recoils. For 1,000 years, no one has dared to lay a hand on a king of France without his permission. To be bound like a common thief, a highwayman, or a murderer is a stain on his soul that Louis cannot easily accept. "I will never consent to this," he cries out, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and indignation. For a moment, it looks as though there might be a struggle on the very steps of the scaffold. The guards tighten their grip on their muskets. The crowd ripples with a sudden nervous energy. It is the priest Edgeworth who leans in and whispers the only words that could possibly move the king. He tells Louis that this last insult is but one more way he can resemble the Saviour who died for him. He frames the humiliation not as a defeat, but as a final holy sacrifice. Louis looks at the ropes, looks at the sky, and finally, with a heavy, resigned sigh, offers his hands. The rope bites into his skin, forcing his shoulders back, stripping him of the last of his physical autonomy. Then comes the toilette of the condemned. It is a ritualized act of preparation, but in the hands of the revolutionaries, it is a surgical strike against his dignity. They bring out the shears. They do not cut his hair with the care of a barber. They hack at it, shearing the locks away from the nape of his neck to ensure that nothing, no strand of hair, no scrap of silk, will obstruct the path of the blade. The powdered hair that once symbolized his divine status falls in clumps into the mud of the square. Louis feels the cold air against his bare neck, a sensation so intimate and so terrifying that it serves as a physical harbinger of the steel to come. He is being unmade. Piece by piece, the king is being dismantled, turned into a collection of biological parts to be processed by the machinery of the state. Inside his mind, the noise of the world begins to blur. He thinks of Marie Antoinette, locked away in the darkness of the temple, perhaps listening for the sound of the cannons that will announce his end. He thinks of his son, the boy who should have been Louis XVI, now a prisoner of men who want to erase his very name. He feels a profound sense of failure, not for his crimes, for he believes he has committed none, but for his inability to save the people from themselves. He is a man who truly believed that his power was a gift from God, and the realization that God is not intervening, that the heavens are as silent as the grey clouds above, is a weight that almost crushes him. Yet, beneath the fear, there is a burgeoning sense of mission. He is convinced that if he can only reach the hearts of the people, he can stop the madness. He believes that the real France is still there, hidden beneath the red caps and the revolutionary slogans. He just needs to speak. The climb up the stairs to the platform is a slow, agonizing journey. There are 15 steps, and each one feels like a mile. The wood groans under his feet. The smell of the square hits him, the scent of damp earth, horse manure, and the metallic tang of the guillotine's mechanism. When he finally reaches the top, he finds himself face to face with the instrument of his death. Up close, the guillotine is not an abstract symbol. It is a massive, heavy machine of oak and iron. The bascule, the wooden plank that will hold his body, is stained with the ghosts of those who went before him. He stands there for a second, looking out over the crowd. From this height, the 100,000 people look like a single, monstrous organism. He sees the National Guard, their bayonets forming a hedge of steel around the scaffold. He sees the cannons pointed not at the scaffold, but at the crowd, a clear warning that any attempt to rescue the king will result in a massacre. This is the moment. The executioners move to grab him, to thrust him onto the plank, but Louis, fueled by a sudden, desperate surge of energy, breaks free. Despite his bound hands, he lunges toward the edge of the platform. He stands at the very brink, his chest heaving, his eyes searching the faces below for a sign of recognition, of mercy, of the old loyalty. For a heartbeat, the world stops. The silence in the square becomes so absolute that the flapping of a bird's wings can be heard in the distance. Louis XVI, the King of France, draws a deep breath, his lungs filling with the freezing air of a world he is about to leave. He opens his mouth to deliver the speech he has rehearsed in the darkness of his cell. He begins to speak. People, I die innocent. I forgive those who are the cause of my death. I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never fall on France. His voice is clear. It is strong. It carries further than anyone expected. In the front rows of the crowd, some people begin to weep. A woman faints. A soldier lowers his gaze. The air in the square shifts. The atmosphere of bloodlust begins to crack, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing wave of pity. The revolutionary leaders, standing near the base of the scaffold, feel the ground shifting beneath them. They see the reaction of the crowd. They know that if the king continues, if he is allowed to finish his plea for his people, the fragile republic could vanish in a heartbeat. The mob is a fickle thing, and the king is currently winning its soul. Standing near the drummers is Antoine-Joseph Santerre, the commander of the National Guard and a man who has no room for pity. He sees the king's lips moving, he hears the words of forgiveness, and he realizes that this is the most dangerous moment of the entire revolution. If the king dies as a martyr who spoke to his people, he will be more powerful in death than he ever was in life. Santerre raises his hand, his face a mask of cold, political iron. He does not look at the king. He looks at the 80 drummers who have been positioned in a circle around the scaffold. His hand drops in a sharp, violent motion. Suddenly, the world explodes into noise. The drummers, on Santerre's command, begin a relentless, thunderous roll. It is not a musical rhythm. It is a wall of sound, a mechanical roar designed to drown out everything else. The king's words are instantly swallowed. He is still speaking, his face contorted with the effort to be heard, his eyes wide with the realization of what is happening. He is shouting now, screaming his innocence into the gale of the drum roll, but to the people in the square, he has become a silent ghost. They see his mouth moving, they see the desperation in his gestures, But they hear nothing but the rub-a-dub of the revolutionary drums. It is a tactical erasure. The Republic has not just sentenced him to death, they have sentenced him to a vacuum. Louis turns to the drummers, his face filled with a sudden righteous fury. He gestures for them to stop, but they do not even look at him. They are looking at their drums, their sticks moving in a blur of motion. He turns back to the crowd, but the connection is broken. The people can no longer hear the man, they can only see the spectacle. The silent pantomime has begun. The king is being turned into a caricature, a frantic figure waving his arms against an unstoppable tide of noise. He realizes with a sickening clarity that his final chance to save his legacy has been stolen from him by a simple military trick. The revolution has closed his mouth before the blade has even touched his skin. The silence of the crowd has been replaced by the manufactured roar of the state, and in that roar, the king's humanity begins to evaporate, leaving behind only the doomed prisoner, Citizen Capet, ready for the end. The vibration of 80 drums is not just a sound. It is a physical force that rattles the teeth and makes the very wood of the scaffold tremble. Louis XVI stands at the edge of the platform, his mouth still open, his throat straining to push words against the wall of thunder. But the connection between the king and his people has been severed by a tactical roar. He looks down at the faces of the National Guard, at the stony expression of General Santerre, and finally he understands. They are not merely killing his body, they are murdering his memory. They are ensuring that his final act of grace, his final plea for peace, dies in the air between his lips and the ears of the crowd. In this moment, the absolute monarch of France realizes he has become a ghost while he still breathes. The power he once wielded, the power to command the silence of millions, has been turned against him. The executioners move in. There are 4 of them, led by the haunted Charles-Henri Sanson. They no longer wait for the king's consent. They grab him by his bound arms, their hands rough and urgent. The Republic is in a hurry. Every second the king remains standing on that platform is a second where a spark of royalist rebellion could ignite the crowd. Louis struggles, not with the frantic terror of a coward, but with the desperate dignity of a man who still believes he has something left to say. He is forced toward the center of the machine. The guillotine, towering above him, is a masterpiece of cold, industrial efficiency. It does not possess the theatrical cruelty of the axe or the rope. It is a machine designed to remove the human element from death, to turn an execution into a bureaucratic procedure. He is pushed onto the bascule, the swinging wooden plank. As his body is tipped from vertical to horizontal, the world tilts with him. He is no longer looking at the horizon of his kingdom. He is looking down into a wicker basket filled with sawdust, a basket that has already caught the heads of commoners and will now catch the head of a Bourbon. The executioners strap him down. The leather belts bite into his chest and thighs, pinning him to the wood. Above him, the mouton, the heavy lead-weighted block that holds the triangular blade, waits in its grooves. It is held aloft by a single rope, a single thread of fate that is about to be cut. In these final seconds, the noise of the drums seems to fade into a dull, distant hum in Louis's ears, replaced by the frantic pounding of his own heart. The Abbé Edgeworth, the king's last friend in this world, kneels beside the plank. He leans close, his voice a whisper that manages to pierce the cacophony. "Son of St. Louis," the priest cries, "ascend to heaven." It is the final benediction, the last tether to the divine right of kings. Louis closes his eyes. He feels the cold, smooth wood of the lunette, the circular wooden collar, as it is clamped down over his neck. He is trapped. He is a king in a neck iron, a god in a cage of oak. Then the signal is given. Charles-Henri Sanson, a man who will later record in his diary that he could barely breathe from the weight of what he was doing, reaches for the lever. There is a sharp, metallic click, the sound of the release mechanism. And then the national razor begins its descent. It is not a slow fall. It is a blur of steel accelerated by weight and gravity. The blade travels down the grooves with a terrifying rhythmic hiss. The sound of the impact is a dull, wet thud that is heard only by those on the platform, yet it echoes through the history of the world. In an instant, the 1,000-year-old monarchy of France is severed. The head of Louis XVI falls into the basket. The body, now nothing more than a discarded vessel, jerks once against the leather straps and then goes still. The drums stop. The silence that follows is more deafening than the roar that preceded it. It is a silence filled with the weight of an irreversible act. The people of Paris, the 100,000 who watched, are frozen. They have just watched the unthinkable become fact. They have watched the blood of the Sun King's heir spill into the sawdust like the blood of a slaughtered ox. One of the executioner's assistants, a young man named Gros, reaches into the basket. He grabs the head by its shorn hair and holds it high above the scaffold. He walks the perimeter of the platform, displaying the pale, lifeless face to the four corners of the square. The eyes are still half open, staring blankly at the republic that killed him. It is only then that the spell breaks. A few voices begin to shout, "Vive la nation and vive la République!" The cry spreads, growing into a roar of triumph that rolls across the Place de la Révolution. Some men break through the lines of guards, rushing toward the scaffold. They dip their handkerchiefs, their pikes, even their fingers into the blood that is dripping through the floorboards of the platform. They want a souvenir of the day they killed a god. They want to prove to themselves that the blood of a king is the same color as their own. But as the sun begins to climb higher into the winter sky, the celebratory mood hides a dark, encroaching shadow. The death of Louis XVI was not the end of the revolution. It was the opening of the floodgates. By killing the king, the revolutionaries had burned the ships behind them. There was no turning back now. The monarchies of Europe, horrified by the regicide, would soon declare war on France, surrounding the nation with steel. Internally, the revolution would begin to turn on itself. The same men who stood on that scaffold and ordered the drums to roll, Santerre, Robespierre, Danton, would soon find themselves looking up at that same slanted blade. The guillotine, having tasted royal blood, developed an appetite that could not be sated. The body of Louis XVI was not given back to his family. It was loaded into a simple cart and taken to the cemetery of the Madeleine. There, in a grave that had been dug deep and filled with layers of quicklime, the king was buried. The revolutionaries wanted him to disappear, to dissolve into the earth, so that no royalist could ever turn his grave into a shrine. They wanted to erase the man as effectively as they had silenced his voice. They believed that by destroying the body, they were destroying the idea. But history is not so easily buried. The secret of that morning, the drum roll that silenced a king, became a mark of the revolution's own fear. They silenced him because they knew that his voice still held the power of tradition, of order, and of a humanity that their ideology could not yet replicate. They feared that if the people heard the man instead of the monster, the revolution might collapse before the blade even fell. Louis died not as a tyrant, but as a muffled ghost, his last words recorded only by the few who stood within inches of him. He had said, "I forgive those who are the cause of my death. I pray to God that the blood which you are going to shed may never be required of France." Those words, unheard by the 100,000 in the square, would eventually haunt the nation. Within months, the reign of terror would begin. The Place de la Révolution would become a factory of death, the blade rising and falling thousands of times until the cobblestones were permanently stained dark. The same people who cheered as Louis's head was held aloft would soon live in a state of constant paralyzing fear, wondering if their own names were on the next day's list. The revolution, in its quest for total liberty, had created a machine that demanded total obedience. Today, the Place de la Révolution is known as the Place de la Concorde, the Square of Harmony. An Egyptian obelisk stands where the guillotine once roared. Tourists walk the ground where the king's blood once pooled, unaware of the vibration of the drums that still lingers in the stones. The execution of Louis XVI remains one of the most pivotal moments in the human story, the moment when a society decided that the future was worth the price of a human soul. But it also serves as a warning. It shows us that when power is terrified of a voice, it will do anything to drown it out. The drum roll of 1793 was the first step toward a world where truth is sacrificed for the sake of the collective, and where the silence of the victim is the ultimate goal of the victor. Louis XVI was a man of many flaws, a weak leader, a hesitant reformer, and a man out of time. But in those final seconds on the frozen morning of January 21st, he found a strength that his crown could never give him. He died with a clarity of purpose that his life had lacked. He was silenced by the drums, but the very act of silencing him ensured that his story would be told forever. The Republic thought they were ending a monarchy. Instead, they were creating a martyr. The blade fell, the head was shown, and the king was gone. But as the echoes of the drums finally faded into the winter mist, the soul of France was changed forever, leaving behind a nation that would always wonder what might have happened if they had only allowed him to speak. The silence of Louis XVI remains the loudest sound in the history of the Revolution, a reminder that while you can kill a man and bury his body in lime, you can never truly silence the truth of his final moment.